September 27, 2007, Charlotte, North Carolina. The moment the house lights dimmed at the Time Warner Cable Arena, 60,000 voices erupted into darkness. But backstage, in the narrow corridor between the dressing rooms and the stage entrance, 16-year-old Wolfgang Van Halen stood frozen, his bass guitar feeling heavier than it ever had during months of rehearsals. His hands were trembling, not from the cold blast of the arena's air conditioning, but from the weight of something far more terrifying than any teenager should carry. He was about to walk onto that stage and fill the shoes of Michael Anthony, a man who had anchored Van Halen's rhythm section for 3 decades. And the entire rock world was waiting for him to fail. Eddie Van Halen watched his son from the shadows, a cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. The guitar god who had revolutionized rock music with his two-handed tapping technique, who had played for presidents and recorded with Michael Jackson, was more nervous than he'd been before any concert in his 40-year career. Because tonight wasn't about Eddie Van Halen. Tonight was about whether his son could survive the brutal judgment of fans who had already decided Wolfgang was nothing more than nepotism in action. Before we continue with what happened that night, if you're fascinated by the untold stories behind rock's greatest legends, subscribe to our channel. We bring you the hidden truths, the backstage moments, and the human drama behind the music that defined generations. The controversy had been building for months, ever since Eddie and his brother Alex had made the decision to replace Michael Anthony with Wolfgang. The internet forums exploded with outrage. Rock magazines published scathing editorials questioning whether a 15-year-old kid, regardless of his last name, had any business playing bass for one of the most successful rock bands in history. Radio hosts debated it endlessly. Some called it a father's love blinding him to reality. Others called it an insult to Michael Anthony's legacy. A few even suggested it would destroy Van Halen's reputation forever. Wolfgang heard every word, read every comment, absorbed every ounce of vitriol directed at him. The pressure didn't just build, it compressed around him like a vice, tightening with each passing day as the tour's opening night approached. Eddie knew the stakes. He'd spent countless hours in the studio with Wolfgang, running through every song in the Van Halen catalog until the bass lines became muscle memory. But technical proficiency wasn't the real challenge. The real challenge was standing under those lights, feeling the weight of 60,000 skeptical eyes, and not letting the fear paralyze you. Eddie remembered his own early days, remembered the terror of performing, remembered how he'd conquered it through sheer repetition and the knowledge that his brother Alex had his back. Now he was asking Wolfgang to face something far more daunting, to walk into an arena full of people who wanted him to prove he belonged there, and many who wanted him to fail spectacularly so they could say they'd been right all along. 3 weeks before opening night, during a closed rehearsal in a converted warehouse outside Los Angeles, something happened that nobody outside the Van Halen inner circle knew about. The band was running through Jump, one of their most iconic songs, when Wolfgang suddenly stopped playing. The music crashed to a halt. Alex's drums faded into silence. Eddie turned around, his guitar still humming through the amplifiers, and saw his son standing there with tears streaming down his face. Wolfgang looked at his father and said, "I can't do this. Everyone's right. I'm not good enough." The moment hung in the air like smoke. Alex started to say something, but Eddie held up his hand for silence. He unplugged his guitar, walked across the stage, and sat down next to Wolfgang on the drum riser. For 10 minutes, father and son talked in voices too low for anyone else to hear. When they stood up, something had shifted. Wolfgang picked up his bass, counted off the tempo, and they ran through Jump again. This time, he didn't stop. This time, He played like the song belonged to him. What Eddie told Wolfgang in that moment remained between them for years. But those who were there that day noticed something changed in how Wolfgang carried himself. The uncertainty didn't vanish entirely, but it transformed into determination. Eddie had given his son something more valuable than technique or advice. He'd given him permission to claim his own space on that stage, to stop trying to be Michael Anthony and start being Wolfgang Van Halen. The opening notes of You Really Got Me tore through the Charlotte arena like a lightning strike. Eddie's guitar screamed through the wall of Marshall amplifiers as he and Alex launched into the song that had introduced Van Halen to the world nearly 3 decades earlier. Wolfgang stood stage right, his fingers moving across the bass fretboard with mechanical precision. But something was wrong. Anyone watching closely could see it in his posture, in the rigid way he held his shoulders, in how his eyes never left the neck of his bass. He was playing perfectly, hitting every note, locking in with Alex's drums exactly as they'd rehearsed. But he wasn't there. He was trapped inside his own head, trying so hard not to make a mistake that he'd forgotten to actually perform. Eddie noticed. From across the stage, even while executing the blazing guitar solo that had made him famous, he could see his son drowning in technique and terror. During the brief pause between songs, as the crowd's roar washed over them, Eddie made a decision. He walked across the stage, something he rarely did during performances, and stood next to Wolfgang. The gesture looked casual to the audience, just a father and son sharing a moment. But Wolfgang heard his father's voice through the in-ear monitors, cutting through the arena noise. "Stop thinking. Just feel it. I'm right here." 3 words that would define the rest of the night. When the band launched into Runnin' with the Devil, something miraculous happened. Wolfgang's head came up. His eyes found the crowd instead of the fretboard. His body began to move with the music instead of fighting against it. The change was subtle at first, noticeable only to those who understood the difference between playing music and becoming music. But by the time they reached the middle of the set, Wolfgang Van Halen had stopped being a terrified teenager and had transformed into a performer. He started moving across the stage, engaging with Alex behind the drums, even sharing grins with David Lee Roth during the particularly wild moments of the frontman's acrobatics. The kid who'd walked onto the stage carrying the weight of 3 decades of history had found his own rhythm, his own place in the sonic architecture of Van Halen's sound. Eddie watched it happen in real time. Between songs, during guitar solos, in the brief seconds of instrumental breaks, his eyes kept drifting to Wolfgang, and what he saw made something break open inside his chest. Pride, yes. Relief, absolutely. But more than that, a kind of joy he hadn't expected. For years, Eddie's relationship with his own father had been complicated, marked by pressure and expectation and the immigrant drive to succeed that had pushed Eddie toward music in the first place. Now, watching Wolfgang claim his place on that stage, Eddie realized he'd given his son something different. Not pressure to live up to an impossible standard, but permission to find his own path within the family legacy. During the guitar solo in Cathedral, while Eddie's fingers danced across the Frankenstrat's fretboard in a display of technical wizardry that still made audiences gasp after all these years, the arena's official photographer captured a moment that would become one of rock music's most emotionally powerful images. Wolfgang stood at the front of the stage, bass slung low, head thrown back, completely lost in the music. And behind him, barely visible through the stage smoke and lighting effects, Eddie Van Halen watched his son with an expression that transcended the usual boundaries of performance. His eyes were wet, tears tracked through the sweat on his face, and on his lips, fighting against years of stage persona and rock star coolness, was a smile of such pure, unfiltered pride that it seemed to light him from within. The photographer later said he'd taken thousands of concert photos over his career, captured every major rock act from Led Zeppelin to Metallica, but he'd never seen anything like Eddie's face in that moment. It wasn't a rock star watching another musician, he explained in an interview years later. It was a father watching his son become who he was meant to be. You could feel the emotion through the camera lens. It made my hands shake. The image appeared in Rolling Stone 3 weeks later, accompanied by an article that finally, grudgingly, began to acknowledge that maybe Wolfgang Van Halen belonged on that stage after all. When the house lights came up and the final notes of Jump faded into the arena's concrete and steel structure, Wolfgang walked off stage in a daze. His shirt was soaked with sweat. His fingers ached from 2 hours of bass playing. His ears rang from the wall of sound that was Van Halen at full volume. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the look on Eddie's face as they met in the narrow corridor backstage. For a moment, father and son just stood there, the adrenaline and emotion of the performance still crackling between them like electricity. Then Eddie pulled Wolfgang into a fierce hug, the kind that speaks of love and pride and relief all tangled together. "You did it," Eddie said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not the way Michael would have done it. Not the way I would have done it. Your way. And it was perfect." The crew members who witnessed that moment, road-hardened veterans who'd seen every kind of backstage drama in their years touring with rock bands, found themselves looking away, giving father and son their privacy. There was something too raw, too honest about it for casual observation. This wasn't the usual post-show celebration or the relief of a successful performance. This was a father and son sharing a moment that transcended music, that reached down into something primal about legacy and family, and the terrifying courage it takes to step into the light and claim your own identity. The music press coverage in the weeks following that opening night revealed a fascinating shift in perspective. Critics who had sharpened their knives in anticipation of eviscerating Wolfgang's performance found themselves grudgingly admitting that the kid could play. More than that, they began to notice something the pre-tour critics had missed entirely. Wolfgang wasn't trying to replace Michael Anthony. He was bringing something different to Van Halen's sound, a darker, more aggressive bass tone that complemented Eddie's guitar work in ways that created new sonic textures. His youth and energy changed the band's stage dynamics, pushing them to perform with an intensity they hadn't shown in years. But the most insightful reviews came from musicians, the bass players and guitarists who understood the technical aspects of what Wolfgang was attempting. They pointed out the difficulty of learning decades' worth of material, some of it recorded before Wolfgang was born, and making it sound natural rather than rehearsed. They noted his timing, his ability to lock in with Alex's unconventional drumming patterns, his instinct for when to fill space and when to lay back and let Eddie's guitar work breathe. Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, himself one of rock's most innovative bass players, told an interviewer, "People were so focused on the nepotism angle that they missed the real story. That kid was doing something genuinely difficult and making it look easy. That's not about his last name. That's about talent and an insane amount of hard work." What the public didn't know, what even most of the band's inner circle didn't fully understand, was the depth of the private conversations between Eddie and Wolfgang during that tour. Night after night, after the shows ended and the arenas emptied, father and son would sit together, sometimes in hotel rooms, sometimes on the tour bus, talking about music and performance and the weight of expectations. Eddie, who'd spent decades as the guitar hero but had rarely been comfortable with the rock star lifestyle, found himself opening up to Wolfgang in ways he'd never opened up to anyone else. He talked about his own fears, his struggles with alcohol and the pressure of fame, his complicated relationship with his own father. Wolfgang listened, absorbing not just the advice, but the vulnerability his father was showing him. These conversations forged a bond between them that went beyond the typical father-son relationship. They became musical collaborators in the truest sense, pushing each other, challenging each other, creating something together that neither could create alone. Eddie later told a close friend that those late-night conversations with Wolfgang, dissecting performances and sharing fears and dreams, were some of the most meaningful moments of his life. For the first time, Eddie said, I understood what my father was trying to give me all those years ago, and I got to give it to Wolfgang in a way that worked for both of us. The 2007 to 2008 tour became more than just a successful comeback for Van Halen. It became the moment when Wolfgang Van Halen stepped out of his father's shadow and claimed his own identity as a musician. The nepotism charges faded as performance after performance proved his capabilities. Critics who'd been harsh in their pre-tour assessments quietly revised their opinions. And most importantly, the fans, those 60,000 voices that had greeted Wolfgang with skepticism on opening night, gradually transformed their doubt into acceptance and eventually into genuine appreciation. For Eddie Van Halen, watching his son's evolution over the course of that tour represented something even more profound than musical success. It was validation of a choice he'd made, knowing it would be controversial, knowing it would be questioned, knowing it might damage his own reputation. But Eddie had never been one to make decisions based on what others thought he should do. From the moment he'd taken a drill and a can of paint to a cheap guitar body and created the Frankenstrat, from the moment he'd pioneered the two-handed tapping technique that would influence generations of guitarists, Eddie had followed his own instincts. Bringing Wolfgang into Van Halen was simply the latest example of that same fearless creativity, applied not to music, but to family and legacy, and the question of what truly matters in the end. Years later, after Eddie's death in October 2020, that photograph from the Charlotte concert took on new meaning. Wolfgang posted it on social media with a simple caption, "This is how I want to remember him. Not the pain of the final years, not the struggle with illness, but this moment when he looked at me and I saw nothing but pride and love." The image went viral, shared millions of times across platforms, accompanied by thousands of comments from fans sharing their own stories of fathers and sons, of legacy and pride, of moments when love transcends words. The photograph became something more than documentation of a concert. It became a symbol of everything Eddie Van Halen represented beyond his musical genius. The immigrant kid who'd transformed American rock music, the perfectionist who'd revolutionized the guitar, the troubled artist who'd battled his demons in public, and finally, in that captured moment of pure paternal joy, the father who'd found a way to pass on something irreplaceable to his son. The real story of that opening night in Charlotte wasn't about whether Wolfgang Van Halen was good enough to replace Michael Anthony. It wasn't about nepotism or rock politics or critical reviews. The real story was about a father giving his son the gift of believing in himself, of stepping into the light and claiming his own space in a world that demanded he prove his worth every single night. Eddie Van Halen, who'd spent his entire life pushing boundaries and refusing to accept limitations, gave Wolfgang the ultimate gift a father can give a son. Not protection from struggle, but the tools to face struggle and emerge stronger. When Eddie died 13 years after that opening night, Wolfgang didn't just inherit his father's musical legacy. He inherited something far more valuable: the knowledge that he'd earned his place, that he'd faced the doubts and the criticism and the weight of expectations, and he'd proven not to the critics or the fans, but to himself, that he belonged there. That confidence, forged in the spotlight of 60,000 skeptical eyes, would carry Wolfgang through the grief of losing his father and into his own solo career, where he would finally step fully out of the Van Halen shadow and create music that was entirely his own. The tears on Eddie's face that night in Charlotte weren't just pride in a successful performance. They were tears of relief and joy and the profound satisfaction of knowing he'd done right by his son. In a life filled with legendary performances and groundbreaking music, that moment of watching Wolfgang claim his place on stage might have been Eddie Van Halen's greatest achievement. Not as a musician, but as a father.